What if Luffy never met Shanks and instead grew up with Zoro and Sanji? Their progress would be quicker. The world government would take notice as the three legendary fighters changed the course of history at Baratie. From the moment he could walk, Monkey D. Luffy was under the brutal care of Vice Admiral Garp. But somewhere along the way, Garp decided that if Luffy was going to be a problem, he wouldn't be the only one. So he took in two more boys. One, a wild-eyed swordsman, the other, a sharp-tongued cook. Since they were raised under one roof, their bond was a lot stronger and they pushed beyond their results. However, it resulted in disasters that you could have never imagined. Despite their shared struggle, their dreams pointed in different directions. Luffy wanted to be the pirate king. Zoro had no interest in kings. He only wanted to be the strongest. And Sanji was willing to fight, but for a dream far away from any battlefield. The only thing they had in common was their refusal to be caged by the world. They would all be raised by a vice admiral, but everything changes when they decide to refuse to be caged. I mean, Garp had different plans. For years, he taught them that the Marines were the only true path. Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji believed that pirates were scum. They thought that pirates were criminals who had no place in the world. Every day, Garp would put them through grueling hell, pushing them harder than even most Marines could endure. If they were going to defy him, they would have to earn it. But one day, Luffy had enough. Zoro had been training continuously for 18 hours, yet Garp was not about to let him rest. Luffy saw his friend bruised. Sanji had to stay silent, but deep down, he wanted to say something. This is the moment that would turn Luffy into their leader. Luffy had enough, and he spoke up. But Garp, instead of realizing that the boys had enough, again punched Zoro to the ground. Luffy came in his way, and he had the same fate. Sanji couldn't resist at this moment, and he had the most painful beating. But that night would change everything. Luffy, bruised and battered, looked up at the stars and simply said, "I'm leaving." Zoro, wiping blood from his lip, scoffed. "Took you long enough." Sanji, barely hiding his smirk, said, "About damn time." They didn't ask for permission. They didn't say goodbye. They just left. And Garp, standing at the doorway of their old training ground, watched them go. He didn't try to stop them, because he always knew this was how it would end. But none of them knew what was about to happen next. They were about to face challenges that would make Zoro and Sanji almost leave Luffy. For them, freedom wasn't as simple as running away. The world didn't care that three ambitious kids had defied a marine hero, or that they had trained their whole lives to be strong. The moment they set foot beyond Garp's domain, they were nobodies. Three brats without a crew, without a ship, without a single berry to their name. They spent months surviving on instinct alone. Zoro took every bounty hunting job he could find. He would cut down pirates and criminals just to afford a meal. One time, he took on 6 pirates at once, and none of them could survive his swords. Sanji took over kitchens in seedy port towns, gambling his skills for food and information. Luffy, as always, jumped headfirst into every situation without a plan, relying on sheer willpower and an unnatural ability to draw people in. But something became clear very quickly. They weren't weak. The world took notice. Before they had even touched a ship, they had a reputation for being too powerful. The Marines labeled them as potential threats, but the underground whispered about them differently. A future Yonko crew in the making. And then came the first real test. It happened in a backwater town, the kind no one ever talks about. Some pirate warlord had been terrorizing the people, claiming the land as his own. The kind of scum that the Marines ignored because he paid the right people off. Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji could have walked away, but they didn't. The night was chaos. Zoro cut down squads of mercenaries with brutal efficiency, but even Zoro was surprised to see Sanji's fighting capabilities. Sanji dodged bullets by inches, punishing every shooter with a kick to the jaw before they could reload. And Luffy was a hurricane. He ripped through the warlord's forces like they were nothing. One lieutenant tried to cut him down. Luffy caught the blade mid-swing and shattered it with his grip. Then came the warlord himself, a towering brute with a bounty of 80 million, a seasoned monster who had killed dozens of bounty hunters before. He laughed at the sight of a scrawny kid challenging him. The fight lasted exactly 5 minutes. The warlord's punches never landed. Luffy slipped through them like a phantom, his movements sharper than even the old man Garp's drills. And when Luffy finally struck, it wasn't just a punch, it was a declaration. One hit sent the warlord crashing through an entire building. By sunrise, the town was free, and the world had its proof. The bounties came. Luffy, 50 million. Zoro, 40 million. Sanji, 38 million. All three of them branded as rising stars, with Zoro calling Sanji number 3. That was the moment everything changed, and it would soon turn their lives upside down, because now they weren't just kids looking for an adventure. They were a problem, and the world was starting to pay attention. For a while, they were unstoppable. 3 warriors raised together, fighting together, pushing each other to new heights. Every battle made them stronger. Every victory brought them closer to their dreams. But dreams don't always align. It started small. Zoro never cared for unnecessary fights, but Luffy had a way of making every battle feel necessary. He didn't fight out of recklessness. He fought because he refused to look away. When injustice stared him in the face, he met it with fists. No hesitation, no doubt. And Sanji sure as hell wouldn't let emotions get them all killed. But then they arrived on an island, which would make them lose for the first time. But losing isn't the major issue here. The real real problem is something else. The island was supposed to be just another stop, a place to rest, eat, and move on. But the moment they set foot in town, something felt off. Eyes followed them from the rooftops. Whispers spread like wildfire. Then Luffy saw her. A little girl, barefoot and trembling, clutching a piece of stolen bread. A towering bounty hunter loomed over her, cracking his knuckles, sneering as he reached for his pistol. Luffy moved before anyone could stop him. His punch sent the bounty hunter flying through 2 buildings. Dust filled the air. Silence fell over the marketplace. Then came the sound of gun barrels clicking into place. They weren't up against ordinary bounty hunters. This was a syndicate, an entire network of mercenaries under direct contact with the world government. 100 men, maybe more. Some wielding devil fruits, some carrying weapons forged from sea stone. Their mission was simple: capture high-value bounties, dead or alive. And right now, there was no one on the island worth more than Monkey D. Luffy, Roronoa Zoro, and Vinsmoke Sanji. The ambush was instant. A sniper's bullet tore through the wind. Zoro deflected it with a flick of his blade. Dozens of bounty hunters charged, brandishing cutlasses, rifles, and iron chains. Zoro cut down the first wave in an instant, his swords moving in a blur. Limbs flew. Blood splattered the cobblestone streets. But for every man he dropped, 3 more took his place. Sanji fought with ruthless precision. He weaved through enemies like a shadow, a single spinning kick sending bodies crashing into walls. He ducked a blade, shattered a man's ribs with a knee strike, and dodged a barrage of bullets by inches. But even he couldn't cover every angle, and Luffy took the most hits. He fought with nothing but raw power, his fists slamming into enemies like cannonballs. A warhammer came crashing toward his skull. He caught it mid-swing and shattered the handle with his grip. A devil fruit user launched a tidal wave. Luffy plowed straight through it and punched him so hard he skipped across the ground like a stone. But they were outnumbered. For the first time in years, they lost. Cuffs snapped around their wrists. Fists and boots rained down on them. Beaten, bruised, and shackled, they were dragged through the dirt like trophies. The bounty hunters planned to sell them off to the Marines, and that's when the cracks in their brotherhood split wide open. Zoro's voice was sharp as a blade. "This is your fault." Luffy, still bleeding, looked up. "You never think, you just act," Zoro spat. "And now look at us." Luffy flinched. From the corner of the cage, Sanji exhaled smoke and muttered, "He's not wrong." That was it. The first real doubt. The first time they questioned whether they were really on the same path. But before they could dwell on it, the execution order came. The bounty syndicate wanted to make an example out of them. They didn't expect Luffy to break his own thumbs to slip out of the cuffs. They didn't expect Zoro to catch a flying sword between his teeth and cut through 5 men in one swing. They didn't expect Sanji to snap his leg chain and unleash a flurry of kicks so fast the ground itself cracked beneath him. By sunrise, the bounty syndicate was gone. The island was in ruins, but things weren't the same. As they stood at the shore watching their stolen ship bob in the waves, Zoro finally turned to Luffy. "I follow you because I choose to." His voice was steady, cold. "But if you keep making choices like that, I won't." Sanji didn't say a word. He just lit a cigarette and turned away. Luffy forced a grin, pretending everything was fine. But for the first time, he wondered if their dream together was built on something too fragile to last. Meanwhile, they also felt the need to build a crew. So who did they meet first? Their journey took them to an island scarred by conflict. Smoke curled through the sky, thick and suffocating. The streets were littered with broken weapons, overturned carts, and bodies that hadn't yet been cleared away. A battle had been fought here, and whoever had attacked hadn't left survivors, except for one. A woman with tangerine-colored hair stood amidst the wreckage, her grip firm on a bloodied staff, a map clutched tightly in her other hand. Her stance was defensive, shoulders tense, eyes sharp, scanning them for any sign of a threat. Nami wasn't part of Arlong's crew yet, not in this world, but she had already learned what it meant to survive. When Luffy approached her, she moved fast, a blade flashing between them in a heartbeat. But she wasn't fast enough. Luffy caught her wrist before she could strike, his grip unshaken. There was no hostility in his expression, but he wasn't smiling either. The weight of what she had seen in this place was written across her face, but there was no time for questions. A cannon roared from the docks. The attack wasn't over. Pirates surged through the ruined streets, sweeping the island for anyone left breathing. Nami's mind raced. No allies, no backup, no escape, and yet standing beside her were 3 men who didn't hesitate. Zoro moved first, vanishing into the fray, blades flashing, cutting down anyone in his path. Sanji weaved between enemies, his kicks landing with bone-crushing force, and Luffy tore through them with sheer, brutal power. The fight ended quickly, leaving the town eerily silent, save for the crackling of burning wood. Nami didn't leave. She stood among them, hands still tight around her weapon, breath still unsteady, watching them with something unreadable in her gaze. And then, after a long pause, she told them she would stick around, not as part of a crew, not as an ally, just until she got what she needed. But Luffy had already made up his mind. She was one of them. Their journey led them to Syrup Village, a place that should have been peaceful. But the moment they set foot on its shores, something felt wrong. The air was too still. Doors were locked. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the wind, and then they found him. A long-nosed boy sat among the wreckage of a ruined dock, his arms wrapped around his knees, a slingshot resting in the dirt beside him. This wasn't the Usopp who spent his days shouting exaggerated stories across the village, pretending to be a pirate. This Usopp had already been forced into battle. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. One One word, one name, Kuro. The attack had come without warning. The man Usopp once thought of as nothing more than a quiet, unassuming butler had revealed his true nature. It wasn't a slow takeover. It was a massacre. Usopp had tried to fight, but he had no real weapons, no real strength, no real power. He had only managed to survive by hiding beneath the rubble of what used to be his home. And now, Kuro was still out there, waiting to finish what he started. But this time, Usopp wasn't alone. The battle that followed was fast and merciless. Zoro moved like a storm, cutting down Kuro's men before they could react. Sanji struck with deadly precision, each kick snapping bone and dropping enemies before they could draw their weapons. Luffy met Kuro head on, and when it was over, the man who had once ruled Syrup Village with cold, calculated terror was nothing more than a broken figure on the ground. Usopp watched the aftermath in silence. When Luffy offered him a spot on the crew, he didn't hesitate. The Straw Hats were born. This time, the world took notice. Their names spread faster than they could control. Their bounties doubled overnight. The Marines were actively hunting. So what happens when the infamous Vinsmoke Sanji steps foot in the restaurant that once saved him? Meanwhile, across the sea, a pair of golden eyes flickered open. Dracula Mihawk was planning something. When the crew arrives at Baratie, the moment is thick with unspoken tension. Sanji returns as one of the most notorious rising threats in the East Blue, and Zeph knows exactly what that means. If the Marines find out he's here, the restaurant will be caught in the crossfire. But that's not even the worst part, because this time, it isn't just Don Krieg who arrives at Baratie. The Vinsmokes are watching because in this timeline, everybody already knew that Sanji was a Vinsmoke. The secret had been spilled out earlier than it should have been. They see Sanji as a threat to their reputation. So when Krieg arrives, expecting to take over the restaurant, he's interrupted by Germa 66. Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji are up against Yanji, Ichiji, and Niji, three of the most genetically enhanced warriors in the world. Zoro duels Ichiji, Luffy takes on Yanji, and Sanji, despite every instinct telling him to run, stands his ground against Niji. By the end of the battle, Krieg's forces are annihilated, but Germa 66 is barely phased. They leave, but not before making one thing clear. Sanji isn't done running from them, and for the first time, Luffy and Zoro see a side of Sanji they never have before. But what happens at the Arlong Park will change their status in the world. In this timeline, when Nami leaves with Arlong's money, trying to cut ties with the crew, Luffy doesn't hesitate, but instead of gathering the crew and strategizing, he, Zoro, and Sanji walk straight into Arlong Park without a second thought. They fight to erase Arlong from the map. Zoro challenges Hachi and the other officers. Sanji takes on Kurubi, and Luffy dominates Arlong. By the time it's over, there's no Arlong Park left. Their bounties skyrocket, and somewhere in the shadows, Admiral Aokiji takes notice. The changes snowball into something massive by the time they reach Arabasta. Zoro, already surpassing his original self, doesn't just struggle against Mr. One. Sanji takes on Crocodile's strongest forces head on, and Luffy doesn't need 3 fights to win. When Luffy faces Crocodile, he knows how to counter Logia users better. But the biggest shift? When the Straw Hats win, they don't slip away quietly. The moment Crocodile falls, the world government steps in. But there's something far more important that needs their attention than these constant battles. See, in this world, Usopp's conflict with Luffy still happens, but the tension is different. Instead of Usopp feeling like he's being left behind, it's Sanji who begins to question everything. The way Luffy charges into battle, the way Zoro constantly pushes himself beyond human limits, Sanji begins to feel like he's lost in their shadow. So when Robin is taken, the crew fights harder than ever before. But Sanji hesitates. When he hears Robin's words, "I want to die," he wonders if it's worth it, if just like him, she's been running from something too big to fight. But then he sees Luffy. Luffy standing before the world government, declaring war against everything they stand for. And in that moment, Sanji understands the world isn't going to stop hunting them. The Vinsmokes won't stop hunting him. But if he's with Luffy, with Zoro, they'll fight no matter what. So Sanji doesn't just go along with the plan. He takes the fight to CP9 personally. He challenges Kaku instead of Zoro. And by the time the crew sails away from Eni's lobby, their bond is stronger than ever. After Eni's lobby, the world government can no longer pretend the Straw Hats are just another rookie crew. With their explosive growth, Fleet Admiral Sengoku holds an emergency strategy meeting. Admirals are put on standby. Cypher Pole gets a special assignment regarding Luffy's background. The 5 elders begin to ask dangerous questions. And someone else takes notice. In the original timeline, the Straw Hats only become a concern for the Yonko after Sabaody. But here, Big Mom, Kaido, and Whitebeard keep a close eye on them. But one Yonko decides to act first, Shanks. Shanks hears about the Straw Hats' rise and realizes something crucial. Luffy is moving far too fast. He's challenging enemies years ahead of his growth curve, and he has 2 similarly powerful crewmates keeping pace with him. At a remote island, the red-haired pirates block the Straw Hats' path. The confrontation is immediate. Luffy, blinded by pride and the fire of his ambition, makes the choice Shanks didn't want him to make. He throws a punch, and for the first time, Luffy loses completely. Zoro tries to fight Beckman. He's defeated within minutes. Sanji takes on Lucky Roux. He's overwhelmed, struggling to keep up. And Luffy? Shanks doesn't even use his sword. One punch to the gut, coated in hockey, and Luffy is on the ground, coughing blood. Shanks leaves him there. No advice, no words of encouragement, just a cold, painful lesson. The loss to Shanks fractures the crew's faith in their leader. Zoro is furious, not at Shanks, but at himself. He swore to be the world's strongest swordsman, yet he was beaten without a real fight. As the crew drifts in silence, an unexpected figure appears. Traffic Trafalgar Law. Law, already forming his plans against Kaido, sees an opportunity. He approaches the battered Straw Hats and tells Luffy that the key to reaching the top isn't just brute force, it's playing the game. The proposal? Ally with him, but on Law's terms. Abandon reckless fights. Follow a precise strategy. Use deception instead of direct combat. The crew waits for Luffy's answer, and for the first time in his life, Luffy hesitates. As the crew stands on the verge of breaking, Eustace Kid arrives. His crew ambushes the Straw Hats. Zoro fights Killer in a brutal duel. Sanji takes on Heat and Wire, trying to protect the weaker crew members. And Luffy faces Kid. Something is wrong. His punches don't land with the same force. His attacks lack conviction. The doubt in his heart is slowing him down. And then Kid lands on a crushing blow. Luffy collapses. Zoro and Sanji watch in horror, and at that moment, the Straw Hats face the real question. If Luffy can't lead them, then what happens next? Luffy is on his knees. The entire crew is shaken. Kid mocks them. Zoro steps forward, blood dripping from a fresh wound. His eyes burn with anger. Not at Kid, but at Luffy. He tells Luffy that if he doesn't stand up right now, then he was never fit to be their captain. Sanji exhales sharply. He knows Zoro means it. And just like that, the weight of the moment crashes down on Luffy. Luffy grits his teeth, slams his fists into the ground, and forces himself up. His breathing is heavy, but his eyes have changed. The hesitation is gone. His conqueror's haki surges, coating his body, radiating power unlike anything before. The ground shakes. The Kid pirates stumble back, and even Kid himself feels the pressure. The battle erupts. Kid's metal constructs mean nothing now. Luffy moves too fast, hits too hard. In a final earth-shattering blow, Luffy roars, "I'm Monkey D. Luffy, and I'm gonna be king of the pirates!" The Straw Hat stands victorious. The bond between Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji is stronger than ever. But more than that, Luffy is different now. He no longer charges forward blindly. He carries the weight of leadership with pride, not recklessness. Would this Luffy be stronger or weaker in the long run? Only time will tell. If you enjoyed this what-if scenario, make sure to subscribe for more One Piece alternate timelines and theories. And hey, what should we tackle next? Drop your ideas below and we might just turn your what-if into reality. Until next time, see you on the Grand Line.